There is a version of World War II that most people carry with them their entire lives. It has clear sides. It has a beginning defined by aggression and an end defined by justice. It has villains who were obviously monstrous and heroes who were obviously right. That version is not entirely false, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. The incompleteness is not accidental. It was built into the peace that followed the war, constructed carefully by governments, institutions, and individuals who had very specific reasons to emphasize certain facts and allow others to quietly disappear. What remains when you remove the narrative architecture is something harder to look at, not because it is more violent, though in some cases it is, but because it is more recognizable. The machinery of the war, the part that actually made it function, did not run on hatred. It ran on paperwork. It ran on procedure. It ran on the ordinary human capacity to do what is expected within a system without asking whether the system itself should exist. That is what this narration is about. Not the moments of dramatic horror that have been examined and re-examined in film and literature and museum exhibits, but the quieter facts, the documented ones, the ones that were written down, filed, stamped, and in many cases deliberately buried, not because they were too chaotic to explain, but because they were too organized. The first thing worth understanding is that the war produced an enormous quantity of documentation. Every major military and government bureaucracy kept records. The Germans were particularly thorough. Their administrative culture demanded paper trails, and they produced them in staggering volume for activities that any outside observer would expect people to want to hide. There were requisition forms for items used in mass murder. There were memos discussing logistics as though the subject matter were freight shipments. There were schedules. There were efficiency reports. This was not because the people writing these documents were uniquely monstrous in some biological or spiritual sense. It was because they were operating inside a system that had normalized what they were doing, and inside a normalized system, paperwork follows function the way shadow follows light. The documentation survived in many cases because the war ended faster than the filing could be destroyed. And what the documentation reveals, more than any single atrocity, is the texture of how atrocities are actually committed, not in fits of passion, in offices, with ink. The German bureaucracy that administered the Holocaust was not a secret cabal operating outside normal government structures. It was integrated into those structures. The Wannsee Conference, held in January of 1942 in a villa outside Berlin, was attended by 15 high-ranking Nazi officials representing multiple government ministries. The meeting lasted approximately 90 minutes. It was catered. The purpose was to coordinate the logistics of what the participants called the final solution, and the minutes of the meeting, which survived because a single copy was found in the German Foreign Office archives after the war, read with the detachment of a planning document for a large infrastructure project. There was discussion of numbers, of regions, of transportation capacity, of labor utilization before death. The language throughout is the language of administration. The word killing does not appear. The participants were not working in darkness. They were working in a conference room, with coffee, in the middle of a Tuesday morning, and then they went back to their offices and began implementing what they had agreed upon. The transportation system that made the Holocaust logistically possible was not built for it. It was the existing German and European rail network, the same one that moved coal and lumber and manufactured goods. The Reichsbahn, the German National Railway, issued standard tickets for deportation trains. The fare structure that applied to group travel, which offered reduced rates for parties of more than 400 people, was applied to transports carrying Jewish families to extermination camps. The railway billed the SS for these transports, and the SS paid from its operating budget. There were accountants who processed these invoices. There were rail workers who drove the trains, switched the tracks, and maintained the schedule. Most of them knew at some level what their trains were carrying. Most of them continued to work, not because they were forced to at gunpoint, though some were, but because the work existed within a structure of employment and routine and social expectation that made stopping feel more abnormal than continuing. The camps themselves were administered with what can only be described as institutional precision. Auschwitz, the largest of the Nazi extermination and concentration camp complexes, was not a single installation. It was a network of camps, subcamps, and industrial facilities covering a large area of occupied Poland. It had a commandant's office. It had a garrison. It had staff canteens where SS personnel ate their meals. It had a hospital, initially for SS personnel, later expanded under certain conditions for prisoners who were deemed valuable as labor. The commandant of Auschwitz for most of its operational life was Rudolf Höss, and after the war he wrote a memoir. He wrote it in a Polish prison while awaiting execution. The memoir is not a confession of horror in the dramatic sense. It is a document that reads, in large portions, like a management report. Höss discusses staffing challenges. He discusses the difficulty of maintaining efficiency when personnel were improperly trained. He discusses the logistical problems caused by the arrival of transports in numbers that exceeded processing capacity. He uses the word processing. He was hanged near the crematorium at Auschwitz in April of 1947, and the memoir was published. People have been reading it ever since, and the most disturbing aspect of it is not the evil it contains, but the banality of the frame through which the evil is described. There is a documented phenomenon that researchers have studied at length, which is the degree to which ordinary men participated in mass killing without prior history of violence or particular ideological fervor. The most exhaustive study of this involves Reserve Police Battalion 101, a unit of German order police drawn largely from middle-aged Hamburg men who were not SS, not fanatical party members, and not selected for any particular psychological profile suited to killing. In the summer of 1942, this unit was deployed to occupied Poland and ordered to participate in the shooting of Jewish civilians. Their commanding officer told them before the first massacre that any man who felt unable to participate could step aside and would face no punishment. Very few stepped aside. The unit went on to participate in the killing of tens of thousands of people over the following months. After the war, when West German prosecutors investigated the unit, they interviewed many former members. The interviews reveal men who were uncomfortable, who sometimes drank heavily before or after killings, who occasionally requested reassignment to other duties, but who largely continued to participate, not because they were forced, because they were there, because the group was doing it, because stepping out felt more difficult than continuing. The Allied side of this history contains its own documented realities that the standard narrative tends to soften or omit entirely. The strategic bombing campaign conducted by Britain and the United States against German cities was not, as it is sometimes framed, an effort to hit military and industrial targets that happened to result in civilian casualties. It was, particularly in its later phases, a deliberate attempt to break civilian morale by destroying German cities and killing German civilians. This policy was articulated explicitly in internal documents. Arthur Harris, who commanded RAF Bomber Command, stated in communications with his superiors that he believed the way to win the war was to destroy German cities one by one until Germany had no cities left. He was not overruled. He was given more aircraft. The firebombing of Dresden in February of 1945, which killed somewhere between 22,000 and 25,000 people according to the most careful post-war estimates, a figure much lower than early claims but still enormous, took place when the military value of the target was questionable and the war in Europe was already effectively decided. The decision to bomb Dresden was processed through normal Allied command channels. It was authorized, it was scheduled. The aircraft flew in 2 waves to ensure that rescue workers responding to the first wave would be present for the second. The American use of incendiary bombing against Japanese cities preceded the atomic bombings and, in terms of raw casualties, exceeded them. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night, possibly more. The city was built largely of wood, The bombs used were designed specifically to create uncontrollable fires in densely populated areas. General Curtis LeMay, who ordered the raids, later stated that if the United States had lost the war, he expected to be tried as a war criminal. He said this plainly, as a statement of fact. The raids continued for months. Each one was planned, briefed, executed, and assessed in after-action reports. The language in those reports is the language of operational analysis. Percentage of target area destroyed, estimated industrial output reduction, mission success assessment. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have been discussed so extensively that many people believe they understand them. But the documented decision-making process around them contains facts that rarely appear in the standard account. The Target Committee, which met in the spring of 1945 to select Japanese cities for atomic attack, had a specific criterion that most histories underemphasize. The committee deliberately excluded cities that had already been heavily damaged by conventional bombing. The reason given in the minutes of the meeting was that they needed cities intact enough that the full effect of the atomic weapon could be assessed and measured. They wanted a clean baseline. They were choosing cities to destroy in order to have accurate data about the weapon's performance. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not the primary targets on the original list. Kyoto was. It was removed by Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who had visited Kyoto before the war and had personal affection for the city. The selection of which city would experience a nuclear weapon was influenced by the personal travel history of a cabinet official. The scale of the war created administrative problems that government solved with administrative solutions, and many of those solutions were then quietly buried. The American military's handling of sexual violence committed by American soldiers in Europe and the Pacific is one of the most thoroughly documented and least discussed aspects of the war. Military courts-martial records, which have been examined by historians, reveal that thousands of cases of rape were processed through the military justice system. The conviction rate varied significantly by the race of the accused. Black American soldiers were convicted and executed for rape at rates dramatically disproportionate to their numbers in the military, while white soldiers accused of identical crimes received lighter sentences or were acquitted. This disparity was noted by some military legal officers at the time in internal communications. The communications were filed. The disparity continued. After the liberation of France, the scale of sexual violence committed by American soldiers against French civilians was significant enough that American commanders received formal complaints from French authorities. The complaints were handled through diplomatic and military channels. Some resulted in courts-martial. Many did not. The French government, which needed American political and economic support in the post-war period, did not press the issue publicly. The relationship between major American and European corporations and the Nazi regime is documented in ways that corporate histories rarely acknowledge. IBM's German subsidiary, Dehomag, provided the punch card tabulation systems that the Nazi regime used to conduct the census that identified Jewish Germans, to organize deportation lists, and to manage camp populations. The technology was not sold once and then lost to Nazi control. It was serviced. IBM technicians worked at the camps. Lease agreements were renewed. The machines required periodic maintenance that only trained personnel could perform, and that maintenance was provided throughout the war. The documentation for this was assembled by historian Edwin Black from IBM's own archives and from Nuremberg trial records. Ford's German subsidiary continued to produce vehicles for the German military using forced labor. General Motors' German subsidiary did the same. These were not independent operations that had escaped corporate control. They were subsidiaries that had been managed and whose value was retained on corporate books in the United States throughout the war period. The Vatican's documented knowledge of the Holocaust and its chosen response to that knowledge is a subject that has generated enormous scholarly debate. But certain facts are not actually in dispute. Pope Pius XI received detailed information about the systematic murder of European Jews from multiple sources, including the Slovak government, the German ambassador to the Vatican, and representatives of Jewish organizations, beginning in 1942. He did not issue a public condemnation of the genocide. His defenders argue that a public condemnation would have made conditions worse for Catholics in occupied territories and would not have stopped the killing. His critics argue that the moral authority of the papacy was the one force that might have placed some restraint on Catholic perpetrators and Catholic bystanders who formed a significant part of the population in many occupied countries. What is documented is that he knew and that he chose silence as a policy, and that the policy was maintained consistently throughout the period when millions of people were being systematically murdered. After the war, the Vatican provided assistance to some Nazi war criminals seeking to escape Europe through rat lines that passed through Vatican-controlled institutions, a practice that is now confirmed in declassified documents from multiple intelligence services. The Soviet Union's conduct of the war contains documented realities that the Allied narrative, for reasons connected to wartime alliance and Cold War politics, tended to minimize. Soviet Order No. 270, issued in August of 1941, declared that Soviet soldiers who surrendered to the Germans were to be considered traitors. Their families in the Soviet Union were subject to arrest. Soldiers who survived German captivity and returned to the Soviet Union after the war were frequently sent directly from liberation to Soviet labor camps, because having been captured was treated as evidence of disloyalty. The scale of Soviet losses was so enormous, somewhere between 26 and 27 million dead, that the system for managing those losses included practices that would have been inconceivable within the narrative frame of a war being fought for human dignity. Soviet penal battalions, called Strafbats, were units composed of soldiers convicted of various military offenses, from actual crimes to mere expressions of pessimism about the war's progress, who were assigned to the most dangerous combat tasks. Casualty rates in these units were extreme. Behind them, literally behind them, NKVD barrier troops were stationed with orders to shoot any soldier who retreated without authorization. The practice was documented in Soviet military orders and confirmed in post-war testimony. Men were shot from behind by their own side for not dying fast enough against the enemy. The Japanese military's conduct in the territories it occupied was characterized by institutionalized brutality of a scale that the post-war Tokyo trials addressed only partially. Unit 731, the Imperial Japanese Army's Biological Warfare Research Unit based in Manchuria, conducted experiments on human prisoners, primarily Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, that included deliberate infection with plague, cholera, typhoid and anthrax, vivisection without anesthesia, weapons testing, and frostbite experiments conducted by exposing prisoners to extreme cold until their limbs froze, then thawing and refreezing them to observe tissue damage. The unit operated from 1937 until the Soviet invasion of Manchuria in August 1945. It was commanded by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii and had a staff of thousands, including physicians with medical degrees from Japanese universities. The research produced extensive data. After the war, General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters negotiated an agreement with Ishii and other Unit 731 personnel in which they were granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for providing the biological warfare research data to the United States military. This negotiation was secret. It was documented in communications between MacArthur's headquarters and Washington. The men who had conducted the experiments were not tried. They returned to civilian life in Japan. Some went on to prominent careers in medicine and academia. Ishii died in 1959 of throat cancer. The American decision to grant immunity to Unit 731 personnel was not an isolated case of pragmatic compromise with former enemies. Operation Paperclip, which was formally authorized by President Truman's administration in September of 1946, was the program through which the United States recruited German scientists, engineers, and technical personnel from the Nazi regime. The program eventually brought over 1,600 German specialists and their dependents to the United States. Among them were individuals with documented involvement in war crimes. Wernher von Braun, who became the central figure in the American space program and was celebrated as a hero of American scientific achievement, was an SS officer who had used concentration camp labor at the Mittelwerk facility, where V-2 rockets were produced under conditions in which more prisoners died building the weapons than were killed by the weapons in operation. This is documented. Von Braun's SS membership, his visits to Mittelwerk, his awareness of conditions there, are all in the historical record. When the United States government processed his paperwork for entry into the country, references to his Nazi affiliations were edited out or obscured. The editing was done deliberately by government officials, because the scientific value he represented was considered to outweigh the complications of his history. He went on to lead the Saturn V program that put Americans on the moon. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1977. The Nuremberg trials are remembered as a moment of justice, and in certain specific respects they were. But the documented reality of how the trials were structured reveals the degree to which the victorious powers shaped what justice would mean. The legal framework used at Nuremberg was created after the fact, specifically for these trials. The charge of crimes against peace, meaning the planning and waging of aggressive war, was a new legal concept. The Allied powers that created it had themselves engaged in aggressive warfare within living memory, including in the colonial territories they still held at the time of the trials. The Soviet Union, which sat in judgment at Nuremberg, had invaded Poland in 1939, invaded Finland, and occupied the Baltic states, all under the terms of the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The massacre at Katyn, where Soviet NKVD units executed approximately 22,000 Polish military officers, police and intellectuals in 1940, was initially included in the Soviet indictment at Nuremberg as a German crime. When it became clear that the evidence pointed to Soviet responsibility, the charge was quietly dropped. It was not until 1990 that the Soviet government officially acknowledged responsibility for Katyn. The Russian government to this day has not completed the investigation. The treatment of German prisoners of war by the Western Allies following the end of the war in Europe is documented in records that received very little public attention for decades. General Dwight Eisenhower created a prisoner classification category called disarmed enemy forces that technically placed captured German soldiers outside the protection of the Geneva Convention, which applied to prisoners of war. This reclassification allowed the army to hold German prisoners in open field enclosures without the food, water, and shelter provisions required by the convention. James Back, a Canadian author, argued in a 1989 book that hundreds of thousands of Germans died in these camps from starvation and exposure. The specific figure he used has been disputed by military historians, who have reviewed army records and concluded that the death toll, while real and documented, was significantly lower than Back claimed, though still numbering in the tens of thousands. What is not disputed is that the reclassification happened, that it was deliberate, that it allowed conditions that would otherwise have been illegal, and that German prisoners died in those conditions after the fighting had stopped. The experience of Japanese Americans during the war is documented in extraordinary detail because the government that incarcerated them was also the government that kept records of the incarceration. Executive Order 9066, signed by President Roosevelt in February of 1942, authorized the forced removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Approximately 120,000 people were affected, the majority of them American citizens. Their property was sold, often at a fraction of its value, or simply lost. The order was challenged in the Supreme Court in the Korematsu case, and the court upheld it in December of 1944, ruling that the military necessity overrode individual rights. The government presented evidence of Japanese American disloyalty to the court. Documents later declassified and examined by researchers revealed that the government had suppressed contrary evidence, including intelligence assessments that found no significant disloyalty among Japanese Americans, in order to secure the ruling it wanted. The suppression of this evidence was documented. The men who suppressed it were government lawyers. They were not disciplined. The Supreme Court ruling in Korematsu was not formally overturned until 2018, and it was overturned in a decision that also affirmed that its logic could not be used to justify similar actions in the future, which is itself a statement about how legal architecture outlasts the specific conflicts that create it. The firebombing campaign against Japanese cities was coordinated with a naval blockade that was specifically designed to produce famine conditions in the Japanese home islands. American submarines and aircraft had effectively cut Japan off from the food imports it depended on, and American planners calculated in 1945 that continued blockade combined with aerial bombardment would produce a civilian famine that would kill millions of Japanese by the end of 1946. These calculations were made in documents that are now declassified. The atomic bombings occurred within this context. The decision about which method of killing would produce Japanese surrender was not a decision between using a terrible weapon and preserving life. It was a decision about which terrible method to use. The men who made the decision were not acting outside their authority. They were acting within the normal decision-making processes of a functioning military command structure, using the analytical tools that their organizations had developed, and they wrote down what they decided and why, and those documents exist. The displacement of civilian populations during and immediately after the war occurred on a scale that the term refugee does not adequately describe. The expulsion of ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe following the war is among the largest forced population transfers in recorded history. Between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and other Eastern European countries in 1945 and 1946. The expulsions were authorized at the Potsdam Conference by the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, which called for the transfer to be carried out in an orderly and humane manner. They were not carried out in an orderly and humane manner. People were given hours or days to leave homes their families had occupied for generations. They were allowed to take what they could carry. They were marched, often by armed escorts, to collection points, and then transported west in conditions that resulted in significant mortality. Estimates of deaths from the expulsions range from several 100,000 to over 2 million, with the higher figures drawn from German government studies conducted in the 1950s and the lower figures from more recent academic scholarship using cross-checked demographic data. The expulsions were legal under the framework established at Potsdam. They were conducted by governments that had just won a war fought, in part, in the name of the rights and dignity of civilian populations. The colonial dimensions of the war are almost entirely absent from the standard narrative, even though millions of people from colonial territories fought in it and were affected by it. India contributed over 2 million soldiers to the British war effort, the largest volunteer army in history. The Bengal famine of 1943, which killed somewhere between 2 and 3 million people, occurred while India was the central logistical base for the British war effort in Asia. The famine was caused by a combination of factors, including crop failure, wartime disruption, and policy decisions made in London. Winston Churchill's war cabinet received reports on the famine's severity and continued to refuse emergency food imports to Bengal, partly on logistical grounds, partly because of Churchill's stated view that Indians were responsible for their own difficulties by breeding like rabbits. This view was expressed in cabinet discussions. It was recorded. The people who held power over life and death in Bengal wrote down what they thought about the people who were dying, and what they wrote down reveals a moral framework in which those lives simply did not weigh equally in the calculation. The French Empire used soldiers from its African and Asian colonies throughout the war, and the treatment of these soldiers by the French military and government illuminates the precise limits of what liberation was understood to mean. Senegalese tirailleurs, soldiers from French West Africa who had fought for France in both World War I and World War II, were demobilized at the end of the war, and their promised pensions were reduced relative to those paid to French soldiers by legislation passed in 1950. In November of 1944, at a military camp called Thiaroye, outside Dakar, Senegal, French soldiers fired on a group of demobilized African troops who had been interned at the camp and were demanding back pay and proper demobilization. The number of Africans killed at Thiaroye is disputed. French military records, which have been partially declassified, indicate that the death toll was in the dozens. The event was suppressed in French public memory for decades. The soldiers who fired were not tried for any offense. The German occupation of Soviet territory produced one of the most extensively documented systems of organized starvation in history. The Hunger Plan, developed by Herbert Backe and approved at the highest levels of the German occupation administration, was a deliberate policy to redirect food from occupied Soviet territories to Germany and the German military, with the explicit understanding that this would result in the starvation of millions of Soviet civilians. The planning documents state this directly. They calculate the food surplus that could be extracted and note that the extraction would result in famine in the occupied regions. The phrase used in some documents is that many tens of millions of people will become superfluous in these areas. They were not being careless with language. They meant what they wrote. The plan was implemented. The siege of Leningrad, which lasted 900 days and resulted in approximately 800,000 to 1 million civilian deaths, most from starvation, is the most famous single episode. But the organized starvation of Soviet territory was a broader policy applied across the occupied East. It was administered by an occupation apparatus with offices, staffs, and schedules. The role of companies that produce the chemicals and technology used in mass killing is documented in ways that corporate accountability has never adequately addressed. IG Farben, the German chemical conglomerate, produced Zyklon B, the poison gas used in the gas chambers at Auschwitz and other camps. It also operated its own synthetic rubber plant, Buna Werke, at Auschwitz using concentration camp labor, a relationship so integrated into the camp structure that prisoners were marched from Auschwitz to the Buna plant each morning and back each evening. IG Farben executives were tried at Nuremberg in what is called the IG Farben trial. Of the 24 defendants, 13 were convicted. The sentences ranged from 1.5 to 8 years. Most were released early and returned to careers in German industry. The IG Farben corporate structure was broken up, but the successor companies that emerged from it became some of the most successful chemical and pharmaceutical corporations in post-war Germany and in the world. They operate today. The handling of Holocaust survivors by Allied governments and international organizations in the immediate post-war period reveals the degree to which the war's moral framing did not translate into practical commitment to the people it had been used to justify. Survivors who emerged from the camps or from hiding or from flight across Europe found themselves in displaced persons camps that bore uncomfortable resemblances to the camps they had survived. Conditions were poor. Movement was restricted. The displaced persons were not allowed to return to their homes in many cases because their homes no longer existed, or because those homes were now in Soviet-controlled territory, or because the neighbors who had watched them be taken away were still living in their houses and did not want them back. The American military initially placed Jewish and non-Jewish survivors in the same camps without distinction, which meant that some survivors were housed alongside the former guards and collaborators who had helped imprison them. General George Patton wrote in his diary that the Jewish displaced persons were subhuman, using language that aligned more closely with the ideology that had produced the camps than with the ideology that the war had allegedly been fought to defeat. The entry in his diary was not a moment of private weakness. It was a reflection of attitudes that shaped administrative decisions about how survivors were treated and for how long they were confined. The structure of German military law during the war meant that German soldiers who refused to participate in war crimes faced potential execution, and yet the record of documented cases in which soldiers were actually tried and shot for refusing to kill civilians is vanishingly small. Military historians have searched the records and found very few cases in which a German soldier was court-martialed and sentenced to death specifically for refusing to shoot civilians. This creates a paradox at the center of the standard defense offered by many perpetrators after the war, which was that they had no choice. The evidence suggests they had more choice than they claimed, and that the system that drove them was not primarily one of explicit threats, but one of peer pressure, institutional culture, career incentives, and the normalization of violence that occurs when enough people around you are doing something that it ceases to feel like a choice at all. The war produced a significant number of documented instances of looting by all major military powers, conducted not by individual soldiers acting outside orders, but through organized programs that transferred cultural and financial assets from occupied territories to the occupying powers. The Nazi Einsatzstab, Reichsleiter Rosenberg, was a task force whose specific mandate was to identify and seize artworks, libraries, and cultural materials from occupied Western Europe for transfer to Germany. It was commanded by Alfred Rosenberg, who was tried and hanged at Nuremberg. The program had a staff. It had vehicles. It had a systematic method of cataloging what it took. The Soviet trophy brigades did the same thing in Germany at the end of the war, removing hundreds of thousands of artworks, museum collections, and library holdings from German institutions and transferring them to Soviet museums and archives, where many remain today. American soldiers took artifacts as well, individually, and in some cases with the tacit acknowledgement of their commands. The systematic looting of cultural property was one of the most thoroughly documented and least prosecuted categories of war crime. The records of the International Red Cross during the war period constitute one of the most complex archival questions in 20th century history. The Red Cross, which had access to German concentration camps as part of its mandate to monitor prisoner of war conditions, knew from an early stage that something was happening to Jews and other groups that was categorically different from the treatment of prisoners of war. It received reports from various sources, including from its own delegates who visited camps. It made a decision, ratified by its governing committee in October of 1942, not to make a public statement condemning what was happening on the grounds that doing so would jeopardize its access to prisoners of war and its ability to function in occupied Europe. The decision was made in Geneva, in a committee room, by people with complete understanding of what it meant. The Red Cross records from this period have been studied extensively by historians, and the organization itself has acknowledged that this decision was a profound moral failure. The acknowledgement came in 1999. The decision was made in 1942. Between those two dates, the work of making the Holocaust possible continued on schedule. The Japanese military's treatment of Allied prisoners of war is extensively documented in survivor testimony and in the records of war crimes trials held in Tokyo and across Asia after the war. The death rate among Allied prisoners held by Japan was approximately 27%, compared to approximately 4% for Allied prisoners held by Germany and Italy. The difference is partly explained by deliberate policy. Japanese military doctrine held that surrender was dishonorable and that a soldier who surrendered had forfeited any claim to decent treatment. This view was codified in the 1941 Japanese Military Code. The Bataan Death March, which occurred in April of 1942 following the American surrender of the Philippines, resulted in the deaths of several hundred American and thousands of Filipino prisoners over a 65-mile march, conducted in extreme heat without adequate food or water. Prisoners who fell were killed. The march was not a spontaneous act of local cruelty. It was an operation under military command. The general who commanded the Japanese forces in the Philippines at the time, Masaharu Homma, was tried and executed for his command responsibility. The use of biological and chemical weapons by Japan in China is documented in records that include Japanese military operational logs and post-war Chinese surveys, as well as the confessions of captured Japanese personnel. Japanese aircraft dropped ceramic bombs filled with plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities. Cholera and typhoid were introduced into water supplies. These operations were conducted by Unit 731 and by Unit 1644, which was based in Nanjing. The operations were approved at high levels of the Japanese military command. They killed an estimated 200,000 to 500,000 Chinese people. Because the Japanese military destroyed most Unit 731 records at the end of the war, and because American immunity agreements further suppressed investigation, the full scale of these operations has never been precisely established. What is established, in the records that survived and in post-war testimony, is that physicians trained at Japanese universities used their medical knowledge to design and execute systems for killing civilians with disease, and that they did so under orders in the context of their employment, as part of a functioning military scientific bureaucracy. The economic underpinning of the Nazi regime's early popularity in Germany is a fact that the post-war narrative of German collective guilt tends to obscure, because acknowledging it complicates the picture in ways that are uncomfortable. The Nazi government's economic policies in the 1930s produced genuine material improvements in the lives of many ordinary Germans. Unemployment, which had been catastrophically high during the Depression, fell dramatically. Infrastructure was built. Public programs provided benefits and entertainment and a sense of national purpose. These improvements were financed partly by rearmament, partly by deficit spending, and partly by the systematic theft of property from German Jews, who were legally stripped of their businesses, their bank accounts, their professional licenses, and eventually their citizenship. The economic benefit that accrued to non-Jewish Germans from this theft is documented in historical research on property transfers during the Aryanization process. Neighbors bought Jewish businesses at prices that reflected the seller's complete lack of bargaining power. They knew what they were buying and under what conditions. Many of the businesses passed to families that still exist. The wealth generated by the theft of Jewish property was distributed throughout German society in ways that created widespread material investment in the continuation of the policies that produced it. The medical profession in Germany was one of the most heavily Nazified professional groups in the country. Physicians joined the Nazi Party at higher rates than almost any other professional group, and German medicine was involved in the regime's programs from an early stage. The T4 program, the organized murder of Germans with physical and mental disabilities, was designed and administered by physicians. It used medical diagnoses to determine who would be killed, medical facilities as sites of murder, and medical personnel as executioners. The methods developed in the T4 program, including the use of gas chambers and the management of large-scale killing operations, were later transferred to the extermination camps. The connection between the disability murder program and the Holocaust was direct and documented. The physicians who participated were not operating outside their professional identity. They understood what they were doing in medical terms. They filed case notes. They signed death certificates that listed causes of death that bore no relationship to actual causes of death. The death certificates were filed with civil registries. The civil registries kept them. The post-war International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg prosecuted 24 major war criminals and produced convictions that sent some of the most prominent architects of the Nazi system to the gallows. But the tribunal, by design, addressed only the highest levels of leadership. The German judicial system after the war was left largely intact in the Western occupation zones, which meant that many of the judges and prosecutors who had administered Nazi law, including judges who had sentenced people to death for listening to foreign radio broadcasts or for sexual relations across racial lines, continued to serve as judges in the new West German legal system. The Federal Republic of Germany conducted its own war crimes prosecutions, but these were limited in scope and slow in execution. The most significant West German prosecution, the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of the 1960s, brought 22 defendants to trial for crimes committed at Auschwitz. 6 were convicted of murder and received sentences ranging from 3 years and 3 months to life. The trials were important. They established facts and created a legal record. They also took place 15 to 20 years after the crimes they addressed, by which time many perpetrators had rebuilt their lives entirely and many witnesses had died. The Soviet Union conducted its own tribunals in the Eastern Zone, which focused on German perpetrators and also on Soviet citizens who had collaborated with the German occupation. The collaboration in occupied Soviet territories was extensive, and addressing it after the war created political problems for the Soviet government, which preferred to present the Soviet people as united in resistance. The reality documented in occupation records is more complex. The German occupation of Soviet territory was assisted by hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens who served in auxiliary police units, administered occupied villages and towns, and in some cases participated directly in the killing of Jewish and other Soviet civilians. These collaborators were drawn from populations that had their own grievances against the Soviet government, including survivors of the forced collectivization and the Ukrainian famine of the early 1930s. In which Soviet policy had killed millions of Soviet citizens. The chain of grievance and violence in the occupied East was not a simple story of Germans killing Soviets. It was a system in which historical Soviet violence created populations susceptible to German recruitment, and in which local participation in German-directed violence then created new cycles of post-war killing and recrimination. The war ended in Europe in May of 1945 and in the Pacific in September of 1945, with surrenders signed on paper in formal ceremonies before cameras that recorded the moments for posterity. The legal and administrative frameworks that had made the war possible, the bureaucratic cultures, the professional networks, the institutional habits, the economic relationships, the diplomatic practices that had generated and sustained industrialized mass killing were not dissolved by the signatures. They were inherited. The scientists who had built weapons went on building weapons under new flags. The diplomats who had negotiated with fascist states went on negotiating in the post-war world. The corporations that had profited from forced labor went on operating with new management structures and new accounting. The legal principles established at Nuremberg were incorporated into international law and immediately began to be applied selectively by the powers that had established them, according to their interests in the conflicts that followed. The systems did not resolve. They adapted. The paperwork continued.